History isn't just wars and empires, it's also a long list of fashion choices that genuinely hurt people. Some trends burned, crushed, poisoned, blinded, or nearly drowned the people wearing them, all in the name of looking stylish. Today we're breaking down 44 cases where fashion wasn't just ridiculous, it was dangerous on purpose. 1. Let's start with the cage crinoline, which might be the single dumbest thing humans ever decided to wear. In the Victorian era, ladies looked at a giant steel cage and thought, yes, I want to strap this to my waist and knock over everything in my path. These hoops were massive and spanned 6 feet wide, so a woman became a walking obstacle course who could not fit through doors or sit on a chair without the dress flying up into her face. But the genius part was that these things were basically giant wind sails. If a strong gust of wind hit a lady on a pier, she could literally be blown into the ocean like a confused ship. Also, since they were huge air pockets made of flammable fabric, if you stood near a fireplace, you became a human torch instantly. It is wild that people accepted spontaneous combustion as just a normal risk of looking trendy. 2. Speaking of questionable life choices, let us look at the stiff high collar for men from the 19th century. We usually think women suffered for fashion, but guys were out here choking themselves out on purpose. These collars were starched so hard, they were basically made of concrete and sharpened to a razor edge. In Germany, they called them father killers, and they were not joking. If a guy had a few drinks and fell asleep with his chin down, the collar would cut off the blood flow to his head or crush his windpipe like a snake. Imagine surviving wars and plagues only to be taken out by your own laundry because you wanted to look fancy at a dinner party. It is the most embarrassing way to go, but apparently looking stiff and uncomfortable was worth the risk of accidental self-strangulation. 3. Then we have the obsession with Shield green, which proves that common sense was not really a thing in the Victorian age. Everyone wanted this bright green color for their dresses and walls, but nobody paused to ask what was in it. People were literally wrapping themselves in rat poison because they liked the shade of green. When women danced in these dresses, they dusted the whole room with toxic powder, so everyone got to breathe it in. The women wearing them broke out in horrible rashes and felt sick all the time, but they just kept wearing them because looking pale and sickly was kind of the vibe back then anyway. It is honestly impressive how hard people ignored the fact that their clothes were actively trying to poison them just to stay in style. 4. We have to talk about the hobble skirt because the guy who invented this clearly hated women and wanted them to stop moving entirely. This skirt was wide at the hips but tied so tight at the ankles that you had to take tiny baby steps to get anywhere. Women actually wore a strap called a fetter to keep their legs tied together so they wouldn't rip the expensive fabric. This hit the fashion scene right when cars started appearing on streets, which was just a brilliant combo. You had ladies stepping into the road, seeing a car coming and realizing they physically could not run away because their skirt had turned them into penguins. They were tripping over curbs and falling down stairs constantly. But hey, at least they looked like elegant bowling pins while they were face-planting into the sidewalk. 5. Let's go back to France where they invented something that led to actual medical cases called muslin disease. The goal was to look like a Greek goddess statue, so women wore these super thin see-through white dresses. But that was not enough for these geniuses, so they decided to soak the dresses in water to make them stick to their bodies. The problem is, they did this in the middle of winter. You had thousands of rich ladies walking around freezing ballrooms, soaking wet while it was snowing outside. They turned themselves into human icicles for the aesthetic. Unsurprisingly, a huge number of them died from pneumonia, because it turns out the human body is not designed to be wet and freezing for 6 hours straight. It is tragic, but also you have to wonder what went through their heads as they poured water on themselves in December. 6. You cannot make up how dumb the Venetian cirrus trend was in the 16th century. The rich people wanted to look pale because having a tan meant you had a job, and we cannot have that. So they covered their faces in a thick paste made of vinegar and white lead. Queen Elizabeth was all about this look. The irony is just chef's kiss because while the white paint covered up their spots, it was slowly eating their skin off underneath. The more they used it, the uglier their skin got, so they had to pile on even more toxic paint to hide the damage. They were literally rotting their own faces off and paying a fortune to do it. It was a never-ending cycle of poisoning yourself to look pretty, which really sums up the history of beauty products if we are being honest. 7. Now look at the chopine, which is what happens when you let shoes get completely out of control. These started as platform shoes to avoid mud in Venice, but then people lost their minds and made them 20 inches high. That is like strapping 2 feet of wood to your feet and trying to walk. Women looked like they were on stilts at the circus. It was physically impossible to walk alone, so rich ladies had to hire 2 servants to hold them up on either side just so they would not tip over and crash. If you fell off your shoes, you were falling from a second-story window, basically. It stopped being footwear and became a team sport where the goal was just to stay upright. All of this effort just to show everyone that you had enough money to buy extra cork for your shoes. 8. We also have the brilliant idea of using deadly nightshade as eye drops during the Italian Renaissance. Women wanted big dilated pupils because someone said it looked seductive and dreamy. So they took juice from the Belladonna plant, which is incredibly toxic, and squeezed it right into their eyeballs. Who cares if it is poison as long as you look cute, right? The drops worked by paralyzing the eye muscles, which forced the pupil to stay open. The side effects were fun things like blurry vision and heart palpitations and eventually going blind. But that did not stop anyone. It is honestly hilarious that women were willingly blinding themselves just to give someone a longing stare across the room. They traded their ability to see the world for a slightly more romantic gaze, which is peak stupidity. 9. Let us talk about the bizarre trend of padded bellies from the late 15th century, which is proof that body standards are always changing. In modern times, women wear shapewear to look thinner, but back then looking pregnant was the ultimate fashion statement, even if you were not expecting. Women would strap small pillows made of satin or velvet over their stomachs to create a rounded, swollen silhouette under their dress. It was supposed to symbolize fertility and health. Imagine the confusion of trying to date in that era when every single woman at the party looked like she was 6 months pregnant. It is the only time in history where having a bloated stomach was actually considered hotter than having a six-pack ab set, and people paid good money to fake it. 10. Let us talk about the codpiece from the Renaissance, which is proof that men have always been overcompensating for something. Originally, it was just a flap of fabric for modesty, but then guys decided to turn it into a competition. They started padding these things until they looked like they were hiding a melon in their pants. It became a massive padded shelf that stuck out aggressively. But the funniest part is that they used it for storage. Because they didn't have pockets, men would keep coins and handkerchiefs and even snacks inside their codpiece. Imagine talking to a guy, and he reaches into his giant fake crotch to offer you a piece of dried fruit. It was basically a fanny pack worn in the worst possible location, and for some reason, everyone just acted like this was normal behavior. 11. Then we have the glorious era of the powdered wig, which was basically a giant lice hotel that people wore on their heads. In the 17th and 18th centuries, everyone who was anyone wore these massive white hair towers. The problem was that hygiene was not really a priority, so people shaved their real heads and put on these heavy wigs that they almost never washed. They used animal fat to style the hair, which eventually went rancid and smelled terrible. Naturally, bugs thought this was a delicious paradise, so the wigs were constantly infested with lice and other critters. It got so bad that fashionable people had to carry special scratching sticks with them, just so they could scratch the itch underneath the wig without taking it off at dinner. You were basically wearing a dirty bird nest and poking it with a stick all night. 12. You have to appreciate the sheer stupidity of the crackow shoes from the Middle Ages. These were shoes with incredibly long pointed toes that extended outward for inches or even feet. They were ridiculous status symbols because the longer your toe was, the richer you supposedly were. The toes got so long that it became physically impossible to walk without tripping over your own feet. So the brilliant solution was to attach a gold chain from the tip of the shoe toe and tie it to the knee. Just picture that for a second. Men were walking around with their toes tied to their knees, looking like they were trying to march through high grass. The church actually hated these shoes because people could not kneel to pray properly without falling over. But fashion fans didn't care because looking like a goblin was clearly more important. 13. In the Elizabethan era, men wanted to look buff, but going to the gym was too much work, so they invented Bombast. This was basically stuffing your clothes to make yourself look huge and muscular. They would pack their doublets and shorts with cotton wool horsehair and even sawdust. We are talking about guys walking around looking like inflated balloons. The absurdity peaked when men stuffed their bellies to look distinctively round because having a gut meant you were rich enough to eat well. The downside was that if you snagged your clothes on a nail or a sharp corner, you would literally spring a leak. There are stories of men tearing their outfits and leaving a trail of sawdust behind them, like a sad teddy bear that lost its stuffing. It is hard to look intimidating when you are slowly deflating in the middle of a conversation. 14. You think modern influencers have too much power? Well, let me introduce you to the Alexandra limp from the late 19th century. Princess Alexandra of Wales had a stiff leg after an illness and had to walk with a cane and a distinct limp. Instead of feeling bad for her, the women of London decided that limping was actually the coolest thing ever. Suddenly, you had perfectly healthy women walking around dragging one foot behind them just to look like royalty. It got so out of hand that shops started selling shoes with unmatched heels, one high and one low, just to help you limp more effectively. Think about that for a second. People were paying money to destroy their own posture and walk like they had a hip injury just because a princess did it. It is the ultimate example of herd mentality where looking cool was more important than having a functional spine. 15. Let us travel back to the Elizabethan era again, where women decided that hair was actually the enemy of beauty. The trend was to have a massive high forehead because it supposedly made you look smart and noble. But since genetics does not always cooperate, women took matters into their own hands and plucked their hairlines back by several inches. We're talking about voluntarily giving yourself a receding hairline until your forehead reaches the middle of your skull. They would pluck every single hair out one by one until they looked like a shiny egg. To stop the hair from growing back, they would rub strange concoctions of vinegar and cat poop on their skin, which is just a whole other level of desperation. Imagine enduring that much pain and smell just to look like you are balding prematurely. It is baffling that the beauty standard was basically to look like a mega mind villain. 16. In the 18th century French court, they took face jewelry to a hilarious extreme with something called mouches, or patches. These were little pieces of black silk or velvet cut into shapes like heart stars and moons that were glued to the face. Originally, they were used to cover up smallpox scars or pimples, but then it turned into a ridiculous secret language. Where you stuck the patch on your face actually meant something specific. If you put a patch near your eye, it meant you were passionate, but if you put it on your nose, it meant you were cheeky. It was basically the Tinder bio of the 1700s, but pasted directly onto your skin. You had women walking around with 5 or 6 stickers on their face, trying to signal that they were single, wealthy, and slightly flirtatious all at once. It must have been exhausting trying to decode someone's face before you even said hello. 17. We have to discuss the wheel farthingale from the late 16th century, which basically turned women into walking tables. This was a hoop structure worn under the dress that shot out horizontally from the waist, making the hips look about 4 feet wide. It looked like the woman was standing in the middle of a dinner table. It was so wide that women could comfortably rest their arms on their own hips like they were leaning on a shelf. Visually, it was hilarious because it made the upper body look like it was floating in a drum. Walking in this thing was a nightmare because you were constantly bumping into furniture and doorways. It is hard to be graceful when you are wearing a piece of furniture that takes up the entire hallway. You literally could not sit in a chair with arms because your dress was wider than the seat, so you just had to perch on stools like a bird. 18. Let us talk about the Japanese trend of Ohuro, which was popular for centuries and involved dyeing your teeth pitch black. In the Western world, we obsess over pearly white teeth, but in Japan, pitch black teeth were considered the height of maturity and beauty for a long time. They used a drink made of iron filings dissolved in vinegar to stain the teeth permanently. If you have ever smelled vinegar and rusty metal, you know that flavor profile must have been absolutely vile. People were essentially drinking battery acid sauce to turn their smile into a void. It was seen as a symbol of loyalty for married women, but to an outsider, it looked like their teeth had just rotted away. It is fascinating how beauty standards can be complete opposites depending on where you are. But drinking iron vinegar for fashion is a level of commitment that I just do not understand. 19. Let us discuss the Elizabethan ruff, which was basically a giant fabric dinner plate worn around the neck. These things were made of linen and stiffened with so much starch that they were hard as a board. The fashion statement was essentially, I want my head to look like it is being served on a platter. But the logistics of living with a ruff were a nightmare. You physically could not look down to see your own feet, which made stairs a fun gambling game. Eating was even worse because the ruff extended so far out that you could not get a spoon to your mouth without a special long-handled utensil. Imagine trying to eat soup while wearing a satellite dish around your neck that prevents you from reaching your own face. It is the definition of impractical, but hey, at least your neck looked expensive. 20. In the 19th century, felt hats were all the rage for men, but the process of making them was chemically insane. Hatters used mercury to stabilize the wool felt and turn it into hats. Yes, the same mercury that is highly toxic to the human nervous system. This is actually where the phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from, because the workers would inhale mercury vapors all day and eventually develop tremors and confusion. But the customers wore these hats right against their sweaty foreheads, absorbing small amounts of mercury over time. It is wild to think that entire generations of men were walking around with brain damage just because they wanted their hats to be slightly stiffer and more waterproof. They were literally sacrificing their sanity for a nice fedora. 21. The Victorian bustle is another trend that defies all laws of physics and comfort. For some reason, fashion decided that women needed to look like they had a shelf attached to their lower back. This was a wire mesh or padded structure tied around the waist under the skirt to make the rear end look enormous. It gave women the silhouette of a centaur. Sitting down in a bustle was a tactical operation because you could not just lean back. You had to perch on the edge of the chair or twist your body sideways because you were carrying a literal cage on your behind. It looked absolutely ridiculous, like you were smuggling a small piece of furniture under your dress, but women wore them religiously because having a flat back was apparently a social crime. 22. Let's talk about the leg of mutton sleeves from the 1890s, which were shoulder pads on steroids. These sleeves puffed out so aggressively at the shoulders that they were often bigger than the woman's head. It gave the impression that she was an American football player in a corset. The width was a serious problem because women physically could not fit through narrow doorways without turning sideways. There are stories of women getting stuck in the aisles of trains or knocking over vases just by turning around too quickly. It is hard to be elegant when your sleeves are taking up more square footage than you are. You were basically a walking triangle, and for some reason everyone thought this was the peak of feminine beauty. 23. In the early 20th century, there was a beauty craze that sounds like a supervillain origin story, which was radioactive cosmetics. Before we knew radiation was bad, brands like Thoradia sold face creams and lipsticks packed with thorium and radium. The marketing promised it would stimulate cell vitality and give you a literal glowing complexion. Women were smearing nuclear material on their faces every night, thinking it was a miracle cure for wrinkles. The irony is tragic because while they thought they were preserving their youth, they were actually giving themselves radiation burns and poisoning their own blood. It is mind-boggling that the selling point of a beauty cream was that it contained the same ingredients used to make atomic bombs. But nobody batted an eye because they just wanted to look radiant. 24. In the 1920s, we had the invention of the fluoroscope for shoe fitting, which is just terrifying in hindsight. These were X-ray machines installed in shoe stores. You would put your feet in the machine and look through a viewer to see the bones of your feet inside the new shoes. It was marketed as a scientific way to get the perfect fit. Parents loved this and would let their kids play with the machine, zapping their feet with radiation for fun. The sales clerks who operated these machines all day were getting blasted with unshielded radiation constantly. We were literally nuking our own DNA just to see if a pair of loafers felt a little tight in the toe box. It is a prime example of how we will use dangerous technology for the most mundane things imaginable. 25. Let us look at the fontange, which was a hairstyle popular in France that eventually became a safety hazard. It started when the king's mistress tied her hair up with a ribbon, and soon every woman was competing to see who could have the tallest hair. They used wire frames to stack hair and lace ribbons up to 2 feet high on top of their heads. Women were walking around with literal towers on their skulls. The problem was that these towers were so tall, they would brush against the candle chandeliers hanging from the ceilings. There were multiple incidents where a lady's hair tower caught fire at a dinner party, turning her into a human candle. You had to duck every time you walked through a door, just to make sure you didn't accidentally ignite your hairdo. 26. Let us look at the macaroni fashion of the mid-18th century, which was basically the hipster movement of its day. These were young British men who traveled to Italy and came back wearing the most ridiculous outfits imaginable to show how cultured they were. They wore tight, bright clothes and massive powdered wigs, but the cherry on top was the tiny hat. They would perch a microscopic hat on top of their giant wig, which was too small to fit on any human head. It served absolutely no purpose other than to balance there like a cherry on a sundae. They carried long walking sticks they didn't need and spoke in a weird fake accent. They were the laughingstock of the town, but they thought they were the coolest people on earth. It is hilarious that the ultimate symbol of being cool back then was wearing a hat that looked like it belonged to a doll. 27. Let's talk about the dimple maker from 1936, which looks less like a beauty tool and more like a torture device from a dungeon. A woman named Isabella Gilbert decided that if you were not born with cute dents in your cheeks, you should just force them into existence by brute force. The device was a metal spring-loaded strap that went around your jaw with 2 hard knobs digging aggressively into your cheeks. You were supposed to wear this metal clamp while you slept or went about your day. Imagine walking around with a wire cage squeezing your face like a melon. The logic was that if you crushed the muscle tissue hard enough, it would eventually just give up and leave a permanent hole. Unsurprisingly, it did not work, and mostly just caused pain and weird bruises, but people bought it because apparently having smooth cheeks was a tragedy that needed to be fixed with heavy machinery. 28. We have to talk about the visored mask from the 16th century because it is one of the most baffling accessories ever. Wealthy women wanted to protect their skin from the sun, so they wore full face masks made of black velvet. But here is the kicker: the mask did not have straps. To keep it on the face, the woman had to bite down on a glass bead or a button attached to the inside of the mouth area. This meant that as long as she was wearing the mask, she physically could not speak. She had to walk around in total silence holding a button in her teeth like a dog with a toy. Some men actually loved this trend because it kept their wives quiet, which is a whole other issue, but the fact that women voluntarily silence themselves just to avoid a tan is wild. 29. We have to discuss the Trados nose shaper from the early 20th century, which was basically a vice grip for your face. In 1918, a guy named Model Trados started selling a metal harness that strapped to your head and physically crushed your nose into a different shape. The ads claimed it could fix everything from a hooked nose to a flat nose simply by applying massive amounts of mechanical pressure. You were supposed to wear this metal cage on your face overnight. Just imagine trying to sleep while a screw is slowly tightening around your nostrils. It looked like something a villain would wear in a horror movie. The fact that people willingly strap themselves into a face-crushing machine just to look a little different is proof that insecurity is the absolute best salesman in history. 30. We tend to think of corsets as a female fashion prison, but in the early 19th century, men's corsets were a huge craze. The trend was led by the Prince Regent and dandy fashion lovers who wanted that coveted hourglass figure. Men were squeezing themselves into tight-laced corsets to suck in their beer bellies and puff out their chests. The result was that you had grown men fainting on the streets because they physically could not breathe. It was hilarious because these were supposed to be tough, sophisticated gentlemen, but they were lightheaded from lack of oxygen. They would strut around looking stiff and upright, trying to hide the fact that they were in agonizing pain, and barely holding on to consciousness just to look slim in a jacket. 31. Let us look at the lead comb, which was the cheap hair dye of the ancient and medieval world. Before L'Oreal, people used a comb made of solid lead to darken their gray hair. They would comb it through their hair every day, and the soft lead would leave a residue that turned dark when it reacted with air. It actually worked to cover gray hair, But there was a tiny side effect called severe lead poisoning. Users would suffer from headaches, memory loss, and eventual brain damage just because they didn't want to look old. It is terrifying that people were literally combing heavy metal toxins directly into their scalps every morning. They were trading their cognitive function for slightly darker hair, which is honestly a terrible deal. 32. You cannot ignore the sheer absurdity of the hennin, which was that tall cone-shaped hat popular in the Middle Ages. You have seen them in fairy tales on princesses, but in reality they were a nuisance. Some of these cones were 3 feet tall with a veil trailing off the top. It was basically a traffic cone wrapped in silk. The height was a status symbol, so the richer you were, the taller your cone got. Women had to duck to get through doorways, and if the wind caught the veil, it could snap their neck back. It was also a nightmare for balance because having a 3-foot tower on your head changes your center of gravity. They walked around looking stiff and terrified that their hat would topple over, which is not exactly a relaxed look. 33. Let us look at the monocle, which has to be the most pretentious way to improve your vision ever invented. If you have bad eyesight, why fix both eyes when you can just struggle with one and look judgmental while doing it? The monocle was a single lens that did not have any earpieces, so you had to hold it in place by aggressively scrunching your eye muscles around it. It required constant physical effort to keep it from falling out. If you relaxed your face for 1 second or raised your eyebrows in surprise, the expensive glass would pop out and smash on the floor. It gave everyone a permanent squint and a look of skepticism. The fact that wealthy men chose to look through one eye while contorting their face instead of just wearing comfortable glasses is proof that fashion hates practicality. 34. Let us talk about the genius invention of wool swimsuits in the early 20th century. Before spandex, someone looked at a sheep and thought, yes, this heavy absorbent material is exactly what people should wear in the ocean. These suits covered you from neck to knee, and when they were dry, they looked fine. But the second you jumped into the water, the wool would absorb gallons of water like a sponge. The suit would become incredibly heavy and start sagging aggressively. You would go in looking stylish and come out looking like a wet, droopy dog with the crotch of your swimsuit hanging down by your knees. It is honestly a miracle that people did not drown just from the sheer weight of their own soggy clothing dragging them down to the ocean floor. 35. In the Victorian era, there was a weird obsession with lover's eye jewelry, and it is exactly as creepy as it sounds. Instead of keeping a photo of your partner, people would hire an artist to paint just a single eye on a tiny piece of ivory and wear it as a brooch or a ring. It was supposed to be romantic, but in reality it looked like you were carrying a disembodied body part around. You would be walking around with a giant eyeball pinned to your lapel, constantly staring at everyone. It gives off major stalker vibes like Big Brother is watching you, but make it fashion. Imagine going on a date and the other person has a realistic painting of an eyeball on their finger blinking at you. It is the definition of a red flag, but back then it was considered the height of romance. 36. You have to appreciate the sheer impracticality of paper collars, which became a huge hit in the mid-19th century. Linen collars were expensive to wash and starch, so companies started selling disposable collars made of molded paper. It seemed like a great money-saving hack until you actually wore one. The paper was stiff and sharp, often giving guys paper cuts on their necks. But the real comedy started when it rained or if the man started sweating. The collar would literally dissolve into a mushy pulp right on his neck. You would start the day looking crisp and professional and end it looking like you were wearing oatmeal. It is hilarious that men were walking around praying for dry weather, just so their shirts wouldn't disintegrate in the middle of a meeting. 37. Let us discuss the chin reducer straps from the 1920s, which were basically bras for your face. Beauty companies convinced women that gravity was their worst enemy and that they needed to strap their jaws shut at night to prevent a double chin. These were elastic harnesses that went under the chin and tied over the top of the head. Women would go to bed looking like they were recovering from major dental surgery. The device pulled the face upward in a permanent grimace. The idea that you could just strap fat away is scientifically hilarious, but thousands of women bought these things. They were voluntarily sleeping in headgear that looked like a wrestling mask just to avoid having a soft jawline. 38. We cannot forget the bizarre trend of men's nightcaps, which you have probably seen in old cartoons on characters like Ebenezer Scrooge. For centuries, men wore these long, pointy, floppy hats to bed. The logic was that heat escapes through your head, so you need a hat to sleep warmly. But they made them so long that they looked like deflated party hats. It is just such a funny visual to imagine a grown man in a serious flannel nightgown putting on a silly cone hat with a pom-pom on the end just to go to sleep. It looks less like functional clothing and more like you are cosplaying as a sleepy garden gnome. I am just glad we collectively decided that our heads do not need pajamas anymore because it was a goofy look. 39. In the 1960s, there was a brief but insane fad called paper dresses. A company sold dresses made of cellulose for about $1, and the idea was that you wore it once or twice and then threw it in the trash. It was fast fashion taken literally to the extreme. The designs were bright and pop art style, which was cool until you realized you were wearing a giant napkin. If you sat on a damp park bench, your dress would rip. If you got caught in the rain, you were in big trouble. But the best part is that they were highly flammable, so the packaging came with warnings not to smoke or stand near heat. People were essentially wearing kindling to parties and hoping for the best. It was a disposable disaster waiting to happen. 40. Let us look at the motoring masks from the early days of automobiles. When cars first appeared, they didn't have windshields and they kicked up a lot of dust and bugs. Instead of inventing a windshield, immediately fashion designers invented terrifying full face masks for women. These were leather masks with glass goggles built in and a weird beak area for breathing. Ladies driving cars looked like flies or deep sea divers. It was absolutely terrifying to see someone driving toward you looking like a movie monster. They wanted to protect their complexion from road dust, but they ended up looking like they were robbing a bank in a sci-fi movie. It proves that we will wear the most insane accessories just to solve a problem that engineering should have fixed. 41. We absolutely have to rewrite history to talk about the bullet bra from the 1950s because this lingerie trend was aggressive. This was not about support or comfort. This was about geometry. The bra was stitched in concentric circles to shape the bust into two incredibly sharp torpedo cones that pointed straight ahead. Women looked like they were smuggling two traffic cones under their sweaters. It gave the female silhouette a robotic and aerodynamic look that is just baffling today. If a woman wearing a bullet bra turned around too quickly in a crowded room, she could legitimately poke someone's eye out. It is wild that for an entire decade, society decided that the most attractive shape for a woman was something that looked like it could puncture a car tire. 42. If you think swimming is hard enough on its own, imagine doing it while wearing a bathing corset. In the late 19th century, women were expected to maintain an hourglass figure, even while splashing in the ocean, so waterproof corsets became a thing. These were made of heavy canvas and stiffened with metal boning. The problem is that salt water makes metal rust, so these things would degrade and snap. But the real comedy is the weight. When the corset got wet, it became incredibly heavy, acting like a literal anchor strapped to your torso. You had women trying to tread water while wearing a soaking wet vice grip that was actively trying to drag them down to the bottom of the sea. It turns out that buoyancy and heavy metal underwear do not mix well. 43. The Victorians had a very loose definition of what constitutes a nice accessory because they were obsessed with hair jewelry. I do not mean jewelry for your hair, I mean jewelry made out of human hair. People would take locks of hair from their friends or family members and weave them into intricate bracelets, necklaces, and earrings. Imagine receiving a gift and realizing it is a bracelet woven from your Aunt Stacy's ponytail. It was considered sentimental and loving, but looking back, it is just biologically creepy. You were walking around wearing pieces of other people's DNA as a fashion statement. It gives a whole new meaning to the idea of carrying a part of someone with you, but maybe we should have kept that metaphorical instead of weaving it into a brooch. 44. Finally, we have to end with the sheer lunacy of vein painting in 17th century France. At the time, being pale was the ultimate status symbol because it meant you were rich enough to stay inside all day and never see the sun. To prove just how translucent and pale their skin was, women would use a blue pencil to draw fake veins on their chests and necks. They were literally drawing a roadmap of blood vessels on their skin to shout, "Look how thin my skin is." It is the most specific and weird flex in history. You had aristocrats standing in front of mirrors carefully sketching blue lines on their cleavage just to impress people at a party. It proves once and for all that there is absolutely no limit to the ridiculous things humans will do just to fit in with a trend. Now you've seen the madness. So answer this honestly. Which of these trends would you still try, even knowing it could injure you? Don't pretend. Your comment will expose your true level of chaos. If this video shocked you even once, hit subscribe and drop a like. The next historical disasters are already loading.